The first thing I noticed that morning was the sound of a coffee cup touching porcelain. Just a small sound. Nothing dramatic. But when you live alone long enough, little sounds begin to matter. The cup sat in front of me at the same table where I had been sitting almost every day for the past 3 years. Same cafe. Same corner. Same view of the street outside where people walked past like they were late for something important. Steam rose slowly from the coffee. I watched it disappear into the air. Funny thing about getting older. The world doesn't suddenly become louder. It becomes quieter. And somewhere along the way you realize something strange. People stop noticing you. Maybe you know what I mean. When you're younger, the world bumps into you all the time. People ask what you do, what you think, what you want. But somewhere past 60, conversations change. Clerks look over your shoulder at the younger customer behind you. Waiters speak a little louder like your ears stopped working overnight. And strangers, well, strangers rarely look twice. You start feeling like a chair in the corner of a room. Still there. Still useful. But nobody really sees it. My name is Tom Harper. I'm 65 years old, and for 35 of those years I worked as an engineer at an auto plant outside Dayton, Ohio. Good job. Honest work. The kind of place where you knew the men beside you for decades. Then one Tuesday morning the company announced they were restructuring. That's a polite word for replacing older men with younger ones who work cheaper and faster. 2 months later I carried my tools out in a cardboard box. After that, life got smaller. Not empty. Just smaller. I fixed things for neighbors sometimes. Changed brakes for a guy down the street. Helped a widow repair her fence after a storm. But most days followed the same quiet pattern. Morning coffee at home. A slow drive in my old pickup. And lunch at Margaret's Cafe on Maple Street. Margaret had owned the place longer than I could remember. She never asked too many questions. Just brought my coffee before I even ordered it. That morning was no different. She placed the cup in front of me and said, "Morning, Tom." "Morning, Margaret." Outside, traffic crawled through the intersection. A couple walked by holding hands. A young man laughed into his phone like the whole world was listening. I checked my watch. It's an old one my father gave me when I turned 25. It's always been about 5 minutes slow. I never fixed it. Something about that felt right. Margaret passed by again and glanced at it. "Still running slow?" "Like its owner," I said. She smiled and moved on. I took a sip of coffee and stared out the window again. That's when the door opened. I didn't notice her at first. Just the bell above the door ringing softly. More people came in than usual that day. Every table started filling up. Conversations stacked on top of each other like overlapping radio stations. I stayed in my corner. Old habit. If you've been alone long enough, you learn not to take up too much space. A few minutes later someone stopped beside my table. I looked up. She was standing there with a small, apologetic smile. Mid-50s maybe. Light brown hair pulled back loosely. Nothing flashy about her. But her eyes, they were the kind that looked directly at you, not through you. "Excuse me," she said. "Do you mind if I sit here? I think this is the only empty seat left." Her voice was calm. Polite. But something about the question caught me off guard. It had been a long time since a stranger asked to share my table. "Of course," I said. "Go ahead." She set her bag down and sat across from me. For a moment neither of us spoke. The waitress came over and took her order. Coffee. Nothing else. When the waitress left, she looked at me again. Not quickly. Carefully. "You come here often," she said. Now that might sound like a simple comment. But I felt something strange hearing it. "Most days," I answered. She nodded slightly. "I thought so. You noticed?" She smiled. "I've seen you here a few times." That surprised me more than it should have. Because the truth is, I didn't remember seeing her at all. And that realization did something unexpected inside my chest. It made me wonder if I'd been walking through the world half asleep. Or worse, invisible. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup when it arrived. For a moment we both watched the steam rise between us. Then she said something that made me sit a little straighter in my chair. "You look like someone who has a lot of stories." I laughed quietly. "Do I?" "Yes," she said. "People who sit quietly usually do." I looked down at my slow watch again. For years I'd been comfortable believing my life had already settled into its final chapters. Work was behind me. Marriage was behind me. Most of the big things were already done. That belief had made life easier, simpler, safe. But sitting there across from this woman whose name I didn't even know yet, I felt a strange choice forming inside me. A small one. Almost invisible. I could nod politely, finish my coffee, and go back to the quiet routine I understood. I could speak. I cleared my throat. Well, I said, some of them might be worth telling. Her smile grew just a little. Good, she said. Then she held out her hand across the table. My name is Evelyn. I shook it. Tom. And as simple as that moment looked from the outside, I had no idea that letting that stranger sit at my table was about to change the quiet life I thought I understood. The next time I saw Evelyn, it wasn't the sound of a coffee cup that caught my attention. It was my watch. The old one my father gave me. It was running 5 minutes slow like it always did, and I remember staring at it that morning thinking something strange, that sometimes life doesn't change all at once. Sometimes it moves slowly, the way that watch does. A few quiet minutes at a time. I was sitting in the same corner of Margaret's café, the same table by the window where I'd been eating lunch for years. Outside, the street looked exactly like it always did. Same traffic light turning red then green. Same people walking past with places to go. Nothing new. But I noticed something that day. I was watching the door. Now that might not sound like much, but when you've spent years eating lunch alone, you stop expecting anyone to walk in for you. Yet there I was, glancing at the door every time the bell rang. I didn't even realize I was doing it until Margaret came by with my coffee. You expecting someone today, Tom? She asked. I looked up. What makes you say that? She wiped the table beside me and gave me that quiet look she had. You've checked the door 6 times in the last 2 minutes. I chuckled and shook my head. Old habit. I used to watch the clock at the plant the same way. Margaret didn't answer right away. She just poured coffee into my cup. Well, she said finally, sometimes old habits mean something new is happening. I didn't respond. Because the truth was, I didn't want to think about it. When you reach my age, you learn to be careful with expectations. Hope can sneak up on you if you're not paying attention. And hope, at 65, can feel like a risky investment. Still, the bell above the door rang again. And this time she walked in. Evelyn stepped inside the cafe like she had the day before. Same calm presence. Same quiet confidence in the way she moved. But this time she didn't look around for a table. She looked straight at mine. And then she smiled. That small moment did something strange to me. Not dramatic. Not like in the movies. Just a quiet shift. Like a room you've sat in for years suddenly getting a little brighter. She walked over and set her bag down on the chair. Looks like I got here before the crowd today, she said. You did. She sat down across from me like it was the most natural thing in the world. Margaret came over almost immediately. The usual? She asked Evelyn. Evelyn nodded. Margaret glanced at me as she walked away. I swear there was a small smile on her face. For a moment Evelyn and I watched the street through the window. Then she said something that caught me off guard. You fixed that woman's car last week. I turned toward her. I'm sorry? The blue sedan, she continued. In the grocery store parking lot. Took me a second to remember. Oh, that. The truth is I barely thought about it at the time. Her car wouldn't start. I had jumper cables in my truck. Took maybe 5 minutes. That wasn't much, I said. Evelyn studied me for a moment. You didn't know her. No. And you didn't ask for anything. Why would I? She smiled slightly. That's what I was wondering. Her coffee arrived then, and she wrapped both hands around the cup like it was warming more than just her fingers. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she said something that surprised me again. You know, I started coming to this cafe about a month ago. I raised an eyebrow. A month? She nodded. Yes. And the first day I came in here, she continued, I noticed you sitting right here at this table. I looked down at my watch again, mostly out of habit. You must have good observation skills. I ran a bookstore for 20 years, she said. You learn to watch people. That made sense. Bookstore owners probably see every kind of person imaginable. Still, there was something in the way she said it that made me curious. So what did you see? I asked. She tilted her head slightly. A man who listens more than he talks. I laughed quietly. That sounds like a polite way of saying quiet. No, she said gently. It's a compliment. Outside, a truck rumbled past the window. Inside the cafe, conversations rose and fell around us. For the first time in a long while, I realized I wasn't paying attention to any of them. Just her. And that realization stirred something uncomfortable inside me. Because part of me liked it. Maybe a little too much. You see, when you've spent years building a life that doesn't depend on anyone else, letting someone step into that space can feel dangerous. Not physically. Emotionally. I'd already had one marriage fall apart. I'd already watched plans disappear once before. And at 65 you start telling yourself certain things. That peace is better than risk. That routine is safer than hope. Evelyn must have noticed something change in my expression. What are you thinking? She asked. I hesitated. Then I decided to be honest. I was thinking that people our age usually don't start new conversations like this. She didn't look offended. If anything, she seemed thoughtful. Maybe that's exactly why we should, she said. I leaned back slightly in my chair. You always this optimistic? She laughed softly. No, not always. That answer carried weight. Enough that I knew there was more behind it. But I didn't push. Some stories reveal themselves slowly. Instead I asked, so what brought you to this town? Evelyn looked down at her coffee for a moment before answering. Starting over, she said. There was something in her voice that made it clear the subject wasn't simple. So I nodded. Fair reason. We sat quietly again for a moment. And then she said something that shifted the entire conversation. You know what else I noticed about you before we ever spoke? I looked up. What's that? She held my gaze for a moment before answering. You never look lonely. That statement landed in my chest heavier than she probably expected. Because the truth was, she was wrong. But hearing someone say that made me realize something. Maybe I had spent so long pretending I was fine that the world had started believing it. I looked down at the slow ticking of my watch again. And in that moment I felt a quiet decision forming inside me. I could keep things the way they had been for years. Polite conversation. Safe distance. No expectations. I could allow something unfamiliar to grow. Not fast. Not reckless. Just possible. I looked back at Evelyn. Well, I said slowly, that might be the first time anyone's ever guessed that about me. She smiled. Was I wrong? I held her gaze for a moment. Then I said something I hadn't admitted to anyone in a long time. Not completely. For a moment neither of us spoke. Outside, the afternoon light shifted across the street. Inside the cafe, Margaret placed a fresh pot of coffee on the counter. Life moved exactly the way it always had. But something inside that small corner table had quietly changed. And as Evelyn gathered her bag to leave, she paused for just a moment. Same time tomorrow, Tom? She asked. That question seemed simple. But it felt like standing at the edge of a small bridge. On one side was the quiet life I already understood. On the other side, something I didn't. I looked down at my watch again. 5 minutes slow. Then I looked back at her. And for the first time in a long while, I chose not to stay exactly where I'd been. Yeah, I said. Tomorrow sounds good. The first time I realized something had changed between Evelyn and me, it wasn't because of anything she said. It was because of the empty chair. You see, when you've lived a certain way for a long time, you build quiet routines. They're small things almost invisible from the outside. But they shape your days more than you realize. For years, that chair across from me at Margaret's cafe had been empty. Just another chair at another table. Then Evelyn sat there. And after that, it never really felt empty again. Not even on the days she wasn't there. That morning the cafe was quieter than usual. A little rain had started falling outside, tapping gently against the windows. The kind of steady rain that makes a town slow down. Margaret was wiping the counter when I walked in. You're early today, she said. Couldn't sleep, I answered. That wasn't unusual at my age. Sleep sometimes comes in pieces instead of full nights. She poured my coffee and nodded toward the window table. Your spot's waiting. I sat down and glanced at my watch. 5 minutes slow. Still doing its job. Outside, the rain blurred the streetlights into soft halos. A delivery truck rolled past slowly, tires hissing on the wet pavement. I took a sip of coffee and looked at the chair across from me. Still empty. Now here's something I didn't expect to admit to myself back then. Part of me hoped she'd walk through that door again. Not in some dramatic way. Just quietly. The way she always did. The bell above the door rang a few minutes later. But it wasn't Evelyn. A tall man stepped inside, shaking rain from his coat. Mid-60s maybe. Well dressed in the kind of way that suggested he didn't worry much about the weather or the price of dry cleaning. He looked around the cafe slowly. Then he walked toward the counter. Margaret greeted him politely. He ordered coffee, glanced around again, and finally chose the table near the window, 2 tables away from mine. I didn't think much about him at first. People passed through Margaret's place all the time. Travelers, salesmen, folks from neighboring towns. But something about the way he looked around the room felt deliberate, like he was searching for someone. A few minutes later the bell rang again. And this time Evelyn stepped inside. She carried a small umbrella and shook the rain from it just outside the door. When she stepped into the cafe, she looked around for a moment. Then she saw me. That familiar small smile appeared. She walked toward my table. Looks like the rain beat me here, she said as she sat down. Just barely. Margaret brought her coffee without asking. For a few minutes the conversation was easy again. We talked about books she used to sell in her store. Old novels people rarely read anymore. Stories about small towns and second chances. It felt comfortable. Too comfortable, maybe? Because that's when the man at the other table stood up. He walked over to us slowly. Evelyn. The way he said her name made her freeze. Not dramatically. Just a small pause. But I saw it. She turned toward him. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then she said quietly, "Richard." The man smiled politely and looked at me. "I hope I'm not interrupting." His voice was smooth. Confident. The kind of voice that belongs in courtrooms and boardrooms. Evelyn cleared her throat. "Tom, this is Richard." Richard extended his hand. "Richard Brooks." I shook it. "Tom Harper." His grip was firm. But his eyes were studying me in a way that made me feel like I was being measured. Not rudely. Just carefully. "Nice café," he said. "I can see why you like it." That comment sounded harmless enough. But the way he said you made it clear he wasn't talking to both of us. Just her. Evelyn shifted slightly in her chair. "Richard and I used to be married," she explained. That answered a lot of questions at once. Richard smiled again. 23 years, he said. Hard to erase that kind of history. The rain outside grew heavier. Inside the cafe, conversations quieted just a little. Margaret glanced over from behind the counter. Richard pulled out the empty chair beside our table and sat down without asking. "Now here's something you learn after a long life. Some men don't need to raise their voice to take control of a room. They just sit down like they already belong there." Richard leaned back slightly. "I was surprised when I heard Evelyn had moved here," he said. His eyes flicked toward me again. "But life is full of surprises." Evelyn set her coffee cup down carefully. "Richard was just passing through town," she said. "Actually," Richard replied calmly, "I'm staying a few days." That statement hung in the air longer than it should have. Then he looked directly at me. "So Tom," he said, "how long have you and Evelyn known each other?" It wasn't an aggressive question. But something about it made me feel like I was sitting across from a man who liked knowing exactly where everyone stood. "Not long," I answered. Richard nodded slowly. "New friendships are interesting," he said. He paused. "Especially later in life." I couldn't tell if that was meant as a compliment or a warning. Evelyn looked uncomfortable now. "Richard," she said quietly, "Tom was just telling me about the auto plant he worked at." "Really?" Richard said, turning back toward me. "What did you do there?" "Engineer." He smiled again. That must have been a steady life. It was the way he said steady that bothered me. Like it meant small. Predictable. Safe. I looked down at my watch for a moment. 5 minutes slow. Still ticking. Then I looked back at him. "It was honest work," I said. He held my gaze for a second longer than necessary. Then he nodded. "Well," he said calmly, "honest work is a rare thing these days." He stood up. "I should let you two finish your coffee." Before walking away, he rested his hand briefly on Evelyn's chair. "Good to see you again," he said softly. Then he returned to his table. The cafe felt quieter after that. Evelyn stared into her coffee for a long moment. "I'm sorry about that," she said finally. "You don't have to apologize. He has a way of showing up unexpectedly." I nodded. Rain continued tapping against the windows. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then a thought crossed my mind that I didn't particularly like. Richard looked like the kind of man who had always been comfortable in Evelyn's world. Confident. Successful. Certain of himself. And I suddenly became aware of something. The grease under my fingernails from fixing a neighbor's truck that morning. The worn leather of my jacket. The slow ticking of a watch that had belonged to a man who worked his entire life in a steel mill. It wasn't shame exactly. Just perspective. Evelyn must have sensed the shift in my mood. "Tom?" I looked up. "Yes." She studied me for a moment. "You're very quiet." I forced a small smile. "Just thinking." "About what?" I hesitated. Then I said something honest, even if it wasn't comfortable. I was wondering if I might be sitting in someone else's story. Her expression changed slightly. "Tom?" But I raised my hand gently. "It's all right," I said. And in that moment I realized something important. Life sometimes places you at a crossroads without announcing it. I could pretend Richard's arrival didn't change anything. I could step back before things became complicated. I looked down at my watch again. 5 minutes slow. Still moving forward. Then I made a quiet decision. Maybe tomorrow, I said slowly. You should let Richard have this table. Evelyn stared at me, and the look in her eyes told me something I hadn't expected. She didn't agree with my decision at all. The next morning I didn't go to the cafe. That might not sound like a big decision, but when you've followed the same routine for years, breaking it feels like stepping off a road you've walked your whole life. I sat in my truck instead. Engine off. Rain still hanging in the air from the night before. The windshield dotted with small drops that slowly slid downward like they had nowhere better to be. Margaret's cafe was just across the street. Through the window I could see people moving inside. Coffee cups. Waitresses passing tables. The quiet rhythm of a place that didn't know someone was sitting outside trying to decide what kind of man he was going to be today. I checked my watch. 5 minutes slow. Same as always. Funny thing about time, it keeps moving even when you're not sure you should. Now maybe you're wondering why I didn't just walk inside like I always did. The truth is simple. Richard Brooks. The kind of man who enters a room like he already owns the building. Confident. Calm. The kind of man who probably never had to carry his tools out of a factory in a cardboard box. And whether he meant to or not, he had reminded me of something. Where I stood. You see, when you're 25 you think life is about what you're going to become. When you're 65 life starts to look more like a list of things you already were. And suddenly a new chapter can feel out of place. I leaned back in the seat and watched the cafe door open. A couple walked in. Then another man. Then Margaret stepped outside for a moment to shake crumbs from a tablecloth. She looked across the street, spotted my truck, and shook her head. A few minutes later she crossed the street and walked over. She knocked once on the passenger window. I rolled it down. You planning on opening a parking lot cafe over here? She asked. I smiled slightly. Just enjoying the view. Margaret crossed her arms. You've been sitting here 20 minutes. Have I? Yes. She looked toward the cafe. She's inside. I didn't ask how she knew who I met. Margaret had been reading people longer than most of us had been alive. I figured, I said. She studied my face for a moment. You planning to stay out here all morning? I shrugged. Thought maybe today wasn't my day for coffee. Margaret sighed softly. Tom, she said, men your age make one mistake more often than any other. What's that? You start stepping away from things before anyone asks you to. That sentence landed heavier than I expected. I looked down at my watch again. 5 minutes slow. Still moving. Margaret followed my gaze. That watch still running slow? Always has. Well, she said, maybe today you should stop letting it decide things for you. She patted the truck door once and walked back across the street. I sat there a little longer, watching the cafe, thinking about the last thing I told Evelyn. Maybe tomorrow you should let Richard have this table. At the time it sounded reasonable. Mature. The kind of decision a man makes when he doesn't want to complicate someone else's life. But sitting there in my truck, another thought started creeping in. What if I hadn't stepped back for her? What if I'd stepped back because I was afraid? Afraid of looking foolish. Afraid of believing something good might still happen this late in life. That's a powerful kind of fear. Quiet. Respectable. But still fear. I exhaled slowly. Then I opened the truck door. The air outside was cool and smelled faintly like wet pavement and coffee. I crossed the street. The bell above the cafe door rang when I stepped inside. Margaret glanced up from the counter. She didn't say anything. Just nodded once toward my table. Evelyn was sitting there. Alone. Her coffee sat untouched in front of her. She looked up when she heard the door. And when she saw me, something in her expression softened. Not relief exactly. But close. I walked over and pulled out the chair. Morning, I said. Morning, she replied. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she leaned forward slightly. I thought you might not come today. I almost didn't. Her eyes searched my face. Because of what you said yesterday? Partly. She waited. So I decided not to hide behind polite conversation. I figured your ex-husband deserved the chance to talk to you without interference. Evelyn stared at me for a moment. Then she shook her head slowly. Tom, you weren't interfering with anything. I folded my hands on the table. Maybe not. But you still walked away. Yes. Her voice stayed calm. Do you want to know something strange? What's that? I almost didn't come today either. That caught me off guard. Why? Because I thought you meant what you said. I did mean it. Evelyn looked down at her coffee for a moment. Then she said something quietly. Richard asked me to dinner last night. That sentence hung in the air between us. I nodded once. I'm guessing he's not the kind of man who enjoys hearing the word no. She smiled faintly. No. He isn't. Did you go? She lifted her eyes back to mine. And that's when the moment shifted. Because the answer to that question suddenly mattered more than I expected. Evelyn watched me for a second before responding. No, she said. I didn't. Something inside my chest loosened slightly. But she wasn't finished. He told me something before he left. What was that? She hesitated. Then she said, he said that men like you usually disappear once things become complicated. I felt a small sting in that sentence. Not because of the insult, but because, sitting in my truck that morning, I had almost proven him right. I leaned back in my chair. Well, I said slowly, he might have had a point. Evelyn shook her head again. No, she said quietly. He didn't. For a moment neither of us spoke. Outside the rain had stopped completely. Sunlight began pushing through the clouds and spreading across the street. Inside the cafe the morning crowd grew louder. But at that table something else was happening. A quiet realization. I had spent years believing the safest way to live was to avoid disappointment. But sitting there across from Evelyn, I understood something I hadn't admitted to myself before. Sometimes stepping away doesn't protect you. Sometimes it just guarantees you miss whatever might have happened. I looked down at my watch again. 5 minutes slow. Still ticking. Then I looked back at her. And this time the choice in front of me felt clear. I'm still here, I said. Evelyn smiled. And for the first time since Richard Brooks walked into that cafe, I realized the story wasn't finished yet. The last time Richard Brooks walked into Margaret's cafe, I was already there. And for the first time since all of this began, I didn't feel like leaving. Now, if you had told me a week earlier that a quiet lunch table in a small-town cafe would become the place where I had to decide what kind of man I still was at 65, I probably would have laughed. But life has a strange way of placing its biggest questions in the smallest rooms. That morning the sky was clear for the first time in days. Sunlight poured through the cafe windows and stretched across the floor like the town itself had taken a deep breath after the rain. Margaret was humming softly behind the counter while wiping down glasses. I sat in my usual chair by the window. Same table. Same coffee. Same watch on my wrist ticking 5 minutes slow. But something about the day felt different. You know that quiet feeling when something important is about to happen, even if no one has said it out loud yet? That's how the room felt. Evelyn arrived a few minutes later. She didn't say much when she sat down. Just a small smile. But there was something steady in her expression that hadn't been there before. For a while we talked about ordinary things. The kind of conversation two people have when they're both thinking about something else entirely. Then the bell above the door rang. And Richard Brooks walked in. He looked exactly the same as before. Perfect coat. Calm expression. The kind of confidence that suggests the world usually bends a little in his direction. His eyes scanned the cafe. Then they landed on us. For a moment he simply stood there. And then he walked over. Good morning, he said. Evelyn nodded politely. Richard. He glanced at me briefly. Tom. I returned the nod. He pulled out a chair at the table without asking. Now here's something interesting about moments like that. Nobody raises their voice. Nobody argues. But the air in the room changes. 3 people sitting at a table can sometimes feel like a courtroom without a judge. Richard rested his hands on the table. I stopped by to say goodbye, he said. Evelyn looked surprised. You're leaving? This afternoon. He paused slightly. I had hoped we might talk before I did. She didn't answer right away. Richard turned to me. I hope you don't mind. His tone was polite. But there was something beneath it. Something measuring. I leaned back in my chair. You two have history, I said. You should talk. Then I did something that surprised even me. I stood up. Not out of defeat. Just respect. I'll give you a few minutes. Evelyn's eyes followed me as I stepped away from the table and walked toward the counter. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Everything all right? Just giving them space. She nodded slowly. Sometimes space is the right thing, she said. I stood there pretending to study the menu board while the quiet conversation continued behind me. I couldn't hear what they were saying. But I didn't need to. Life had already taught me that some conversations belong to the people having them. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't aware of the weight of that moment. Richard Brooks had shared 23 years of Evelyn's life. I'd shared a few cups of coffee. That's not much competition. For a moment I wondered if stepping away again was the safer choice. Walking out the door. Letting them finish their conversation. Returning to the quiet routine that had worked just fine before all of this began. But then something Margaret said earlier that week came back to me. Men your age start stepping away from things before anyone asks you to. I looked down at my watch. 5 minutes slow. Still ticking. Then I realized something simple. Stepping away might feel mature. But sometimes it's just another way of hiding. So I stayed. A few minutes later, Evelyn stood up from the table. Richard remained seated. His posture had changed slightly. Not defeated, but thoughtful. Evelyn walked over to the counter where I was standing. "Tom," she said quietly. I turned toward her. "Everything all right?" She nodded. "Yes." Richard stood and joined us a moment later. He looked at Evelyn first, then at me. "Well," he said calmly, "I suppose that answers my question." I didn't respond, because I wasn't entirely sure what the question had been. Richard extended his hand toward me. I shook it. His grip was firm just like the first time. But his eyes were different now. Less measuring. More accepting. "Take care of her," he said simply. Then he picked up his coat and walked toward the door. The bell rang once more as he stepped outside. And just like that he was gone. The cafe seemed quieter afterward. Even though nothing had really changed. Margaret resumed wiping glasses. Someone laughed at a table near the window. Cars passed slowly along the street. Life continued exactly as it had before. But Evelyn was still standing beside me. She looked down briefly at my watch. "Still 5 minutes slow?" she asked. "Always has been." She smiled. "Maybe that's why you're good at noticing things other people miss." I raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" She looked at me in a way that made the entire noisy cafe feel suddenly quiet. Like when something good walks into your life. For a moment neither of us spoke. I thought about the weeks before she sat at my table. The quiet routine. The belief that most of my story had already been written. Then I looked back at her. "Well," I said slowly, "I guess sometimes life moves a little slower than we expect." She slipped her coat on. "Good," she said. "Because I'm not in any hurry." We walked out of the cafe together. The afternoon sun had warmed the sidewalk and the rain from earlier in the week had completely disappeared. For a moment we just stood there on Maple Street watching the town move around us. Then she asked a simple question. "What are you doing tomorrow?" I looked down at my watch again. 5 minutes slow. Still moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, tomorrow didn't feel like just another quiet day waiting to pass. It felt like something beginning. So I looked back at her and smiled. "Same time," I said. "Same table."